Welcome to 23 Degrees Sideways. Today we're going to talk a little bit about something from the New Republic. This is an article. It's not really about the New Republic. They just happened to write an article about throw the bums out, where they use Governor Andrew Cuomo's giant foam mountain of poop, where he celebrates the number of people that he's killed in New York City as some sort of accomplishment. And the article goes on to talk about how we should perhaps not be looking at the mistakes and the misbehaviors of our government, especially with the coronavirus or the riots or whatever else, as something to be celebrated. And it's the perennial, every election year, especially presidential election years, the perennial throw the bums out, vote everybody out, no incumbents, because it's going to magically fix the system. And there's an argument to that. If you believe fundamentally in the American system, and if you oppose radicalism, then there's an idea that you should actually take a radical action and throw out everyone who's complicit or accepting of what has gone wrong in American politics. I would argue, though, that some of what's gone wrong in American politics is not radicalism itself, but a refusal to be radical. We talk about... So the media presents the idea of smaller government, of restricting what the government can do to you, as radical, okay? And it's not really the case, okay? So that's not radicalism, okay? That is moderation. Moderate what the government can do to you. It does involve moderating what the government can do for you, but maybe that's a good thing too. Anyway, the entire system is rotten, okay? A lot of people say this is not a partisan Democrat versus Republican issue. It's a two-party issue. It's a systemic issue. Whatever. The entire system is rotten. Vote everybody out. And so, this became a conversation online, so I snarkily responded with, well, we all know the answer. A little more government might help. It's for the good of the oppressed this time. And I didn't even mention socialism because that's kind of a trigger in this conversation at this point. But it was a little bit snark. And I got a response that we need not more government or less government. What we need is better government. And, I disagree. I don't think you can have better government without significantly less government. Okay? As an example, the perennial idea of eliminating certain amendments and outlawing political parties and removing all career politicians and civil servants, that's how do you get rid of tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people, without a little less government? You can't replace them all in one big magical day in January. Okay, it doesn't work that way. And so this brings us to the administrative state, which used to be an actual problem and now is considered a conspiracy theory. We've known all the way back in the 90s that we had major issues with bureaucrats determining the course of our government, the administrative state. I'm not talking about deep state or what's that conspiracy? QAnon? That's what it is. Something like that. I'm not talking about that stuff. Okay? I'm talking about the basic administrative state. Public sector unions have more say in how our governments operate than the electorate or the representatives do. Okay? Basic fact. This is a problem. I hesitate to bring up public sector unions because it's always difficult. People don't like to talk about unions and the difference between public sector and private sector, but public sector unions are unions of government employees who write government regulations for unions. End of story. Bad idea. So you can't get rid of these tens of thousands. So the suggestion then is, well, what if we take all the federal employees who are duplicating effort or doing things we don't actually need done and retask them doing things that aren't being done? Well, okay, so the first problem with that, if this is a serious suggestion, is that public sector unions do have more power over how our government operates than we do. They're not going to go for it, okay? The Electrical Service Workers Union of the Department of Defense. There's a local office right down the street in town. So, yeah, 8 miles away. Down the street. They exist. You can't just ignore them, okay? There are lots of public sector unions, and they work together. They have, you can't ignore them. You can't ignore this entrenched power. So, you can't get rid of them. What are you going to do with them? Dangerous question, because there's no good answers. Okay, the second problem is people are not light bulbs. Remember, there was once upon a time a big, huge stink about learn to code. It was a huge white supremacist, racist, Nazi, evil thing. It came out during the Obama era as an argument, an answer to displacement of working populations in mining and agriculture. Why we're displacing jobs in agriculture with our food system. Paper mills, any sort of productive manufacturing industry or productive industry like agriculture, where you were seeing populations of workers get fired or laid off. And the answer was, well, learn to code. And it was a throwaway answer. You don't care about the people. They're light bulbs. Just do something else. Just learn something else. Doesn't matter if you've got 50 years experience working on fuel injection systems that you've been messing with since you were 8 years old. Learn to code. Just learn to code. Well, then it got turned around when the media outrage bubble burst and people started telling the activist reporters learn to code, and then it became a racist, horrible thing because it was evil when you did it to them. But it was okay when you did it to the coal miners in West Virginia. Go figure. People aren't light bulbs. Learn to code is not an answer. Either way, you can't just state that Administrator X, this girl who's been working in an office for 20 years or 15 years, is now working on infrastructure projects and building bridges. Because we said so. It doesn't work that way. You can't decide that Comptroller Y, who's got the social skills of a freaking psychotic slug, is suddenly going to deal with social health care. Because he's not suited to it. You can't just do that. You can't plug and play people that way. So this is a big problem. Third problem. Various governments employ, depending on the state, 11 to 26% of the working population. Okay? Total working population. Depending on the state, 11 to 26%. By any economic model, that much of a monopoly is way too much. That's too much government. There is no way to make that an appropriate amount of government. Now, there's this question, okay? If we're going to not massively reduce the size of government, we're going to take these federal employees who are duplicating all this effort or wasting all this effort or wasting all this money, and we're going to put them in better jobs, and we're going to do useful things with them. Well, who decides? Okay? You've got irritating people like me, citizens who are mouthy and write letters and are horrible and get in the way of all that progress. And well, even if you eliminate the voices of these pesky, irritating citizens like me, the ones you disagree with, because the ones you agree with are fine, then you end up with a mature elite that gets to do the deciding for you. That same elite is going to be fighting night and day to control who uses that 35 million people in the government, this is federal and state, workforce, who are now slaves, Because, of course, as much as I hate public sector unions, you've just now created a system where they don't have them. It's do as you are told, switch jobs when we tell you, or lose your pension and your paycheck and starve. That's slavery. Okay. Well, now you have to use, you have elites fighting over those 35 million people and $4.75 trillion of funding. Oh, that's going to work really well. So much better than us pesky citizens writing letters. So, there's this notion of too big to fail that we had back in the late Bush, early Obama economic crisis, okay? And it was kind of, people got really angry about this. There's no reason a company should be too big to fail, you know? There's just, you know, these companies with tens of thousands of employees, they shouldn't be too big to be allowed to fail. There's issues there both ways, right? Well, there's another idea, and it's called too big to be good. And by good, I mean too large to be just, effective, or fair. Now, life isn't fair, but government must be fair to be legitimate, okay? As fair as possible. Adaptive, responsive, or even cognizant of its own goals. And that is, we have a government that is too big to be good, too big to be just, too big to be effective, too big to be fair, too big to be adaptive, too big to be responsive, and too big to even be cognizant of its own goals. Society is not government. Government is not society. Social responsibilities and goals are not government responsibilities and goals or duties. Conversely, government responsibilities and duties are certainly not social responsibilities and duties. Have you paid attention to America in 2020? Okay? It's really obvious that social and government do not always match very well. So we often see these arguments about the selfishness of the American taxpayer, how they want, I've got mine, screw you, Jack. And that's not how it works, okay? American taxpayers generally pay taxes and know that they pay taxes and expect something for those taxes. What we're getting is not something for those taxes, okay? You say we're selfish because we don't want to pay more taxes for the next manufactured emergency spending on oppression, whatever the latest emergency is. Nah. We pay enough. We pay more than enough. You can argue this person didn't pay their fair share and this person paid too much. We pay enough. More than enough. We're not getting what we pay for. And a lot of that is because it's too big. No system this large can operate effectively. So yeah, you want to throw the bums out. I think there's less about the election and more about the pure size and scope of government. That's all for this one. Stay sideways.